The message arrived on a Tuesday. Not that Tuesday meant anything to the Velhari conclave. They didn't track time in days or weeks or the slow crawl of a planet spinning around a star. They tracked time in dominions, each dominion being roughly 400 years of consolidated galactic power. They were currently in their 9th dominion. They had never lost one. The message was short,
clean,
almost polite. To the governing body of the Velhari conclave, the people of Earth formally reject your terms of subjugation. We will not surrender our resources, our biology, or our autonomy. Any vessel crossing the boundary of our solar system after the 48th rotation of our moon will be considered an act of aggression and treated accordingly. Regards, the United Earth Council. Supreme Conductor Valeth read it 3 times. Not because it was complicated, because she genuinely could not process the emotional texture of it. She was a tall being, most Velhari were, with a body like layered smoke frozen mid-pore, her 4 sensory stalks arranged in a crown above what humans might loosely call a head. Her skin, if you could call it that, shifted color with her emotional state. Right now it was cycling through pale yellow amusement and a deep, confused violet that her advisors had never seen on her before. They said regards, she said quietly. Her second, Orith, rippled with the Velhari equivalent of a nervous laugh. They did. As if the affair were a business dispute. Yes. As if we were colleagues who had a minor disagreement over resource allocation. Supreme Conductor. Regards. She set the message down on the light surface of her command table. Please pull together all available information on this species. Not the military assessments. The anthropological files. The deep ones. The ones our cultural observers compiled over the last 60 years of watching them. Orith hesitated. Those files contain mostly confusion, Supreme Conductor. Our observers found them very difficult to categorize. Valeth's skin turned a slow, deliberate red, the color of someone who has already made a decision and is simply waiting for the universe to catch up.
Good, she said.
Then let's start there. The anthropological files on humanity were, to put it gently, a disaster of documentation. Not because the observers had done poor work. The Velhari cultural observers were the finest in the known galaxy, beings who had catalogued 43 civilizations with perfect analytical precision, who had predicted the collapse of the Duranic Empire 300 years before it happened simply by watching how their young ones played. The problem was that humanity kept breaking their frameworks. The first observer assigned to Earth, a meticulous researcher named Sevek, had spent 11 years studying human social structures before filing a report that began, "I must confess that I am no longer certain what I am looking at." He had expected hierarchies. Humanity had hierarchies, but they also actively resented them, even while maintaining them. He had expected resource competition. They competed, but also gave resources away randomly to strangers, sometimes to their own detriment, and seemed to feel good about this. He had expected clear in-group and out-group behavior. They had this too, but the borders of the groups shifted constantly, sometimes within a single conversation, and humans seemed capable of grieving the enemies they had just defeated. They mourn, Sevek had written, with the Velhari equivalent of italics indicating deep bewilderment. They mourn their violence. I have observed 31 civilizations capable of warfare. None of the others mourn it. They celebrate it, justify it, or simply process it as neutral information. But these creatures fight, and then they sit in the aftermath and feel terrible about it, and then they do it again. I do not have a framework for this. Valeth read this standing up. She read the next 40 years of reports the same way. By the time she reached the final observer's notes, a young researcher named Isla, who had lived embedded near a small human coastal city for 6 years, her skin had gone completely still. No color cycling, just a flat, unreadable white. Isla's final entry read, "I came here to study a species preparing for Velhari integration. I leave having studied a species that has, in the span of my observation, experienced 17 major collective tragedies, rebuilt each time, argued viciously about how to rebuild, created extraordinary art about the arguing, and then named public spaces after the people they lost. They are not preparing for anything. They are always, simultaneously, in the middle of everything. I don't think they experience time the way we do. I don't think they experience anything the way we do. I am deeply unsettled, and we should reconsider the integration timeline. That report had been filed 14 months ago. The integration timeline had not been reconsidered. And now it was Tuesday. The Velhari War Chamber was carved from the living core of their flagship, the Everlasting Ninth, a vessel so large that smaller civilizations had initially mistaken it for a rogue moon. Its walls were grown, not built, from a mineral that the Velhari had cultivated across 6 centuries to respond to the emotional resonance of those inside. When the chamber was calm, the walls glowed a deep, settled blue. When the room was tense, the lights dimmed. When fear entered, which was rare, in 9 dominions of unchallenged power, they went black. The walls were very dark tonight. Not black. Not yet. But they were darker than any of the 12 high conductors in the room had seen in their lifetimes. Let's establish facts, Valeth said, standing at the center of the curved table. Not projections. Not models. Facts. Her military commander, a broad-plated elder named Dross, pulled up the holographic display. Humanity has a single inhabited world. One moon, partially terraformed for resource extraction. No interstellar vessels of their own. They have not yet achieved full travel. Their weapons technology is, by our standard metrics, approximately 200 years behind ours.
He paused.
By conventional assessment, this conflict ends within 1 rotation cycle, 3 weeks in their time. And, by unconventional assessment, Valeth asked. Silence. Someone has an unconventional assessment, she said. It wasn't a question. A younger conductor, Maya, barely into her 2nd century, her sensory stalks still carrying the slight translucency of youth, raised one carefully. I reviewed the observer files last night. All of them, not just the summaries. And I think our metrics are wrong. She said it quietly, like someone placing a fragile thing on a table. Not outdated. Not incomplete.
Wrong.
Categorically wrong for this particular species. Dross's plating shifted, a sign of irritation. Our metrics have successfully predicted the outcomes of 216 conflicts across 9 dominions. Against species we understood, Maya said. This was against species whose behavior fit within the architecture of our models. Humanity doesn't. She pulled up Sevic's original report. Our first observer said it 40 years ago. They break frameworks. Every observer since has said the same thing in different words. We have 60 years of documentation that amounts to, we don't know what this is, and we are about to go to war with it. The room was quiet. The walls darkened slightly. What specifically concerns you? Valeth asked. Maya was quiet for a moment. Then, they named it. The Declaration. They called it war. They used the word themselves, plainly, in a document that was also politely signed. And then, she hesitated. I ran analysis on their public communication channels in the hours after the declaration was sent. I expected fear. Preparation. The standard pre-conflict behavioral signatures we see in every species facing Velhari engagement. What did you find instead? Jokes, Maya said. Thousands of them. They were making jokes about it, sending each other small images with humorous captions. One of their cultural aggregation platforms had a thread of over 2 million responses, mostly comedic, about the declaration. She paused. And underneath the jokes, and this is the part one cannot fit into any model, underneath them, I found genuine resolve. The humor and the seriousness were not in opposition. They occurred simultaneously.
The room sat with that.
A species that jokes about its extinction, Dross said finally. That's not resolved. That's delusion. Or, Valeth said, her skin going that still white again. It's something we don't have a word for. Marcus Webb did not want to be the person who explained humanity to an alien war council. He was 34 years old, a linguist by training and a crisis negotiator by accident. He'd fallen into the work after a hostage situation at a conference he'd been attending for completely unrelated reasons, and his instinct to simply talk to people had resolved it before the tactical team finished suiting up. That had been 8 years ago. He'd since talked down 11 situations that should have ended badly. He was good at it in the way some people are good at things they never asked to be good at, naturally, uncomfortably, with a constant quiet suspicion that he was one bad day away from the skills simply vanishing. He was sitting in a bunker under what used to be Geneva when General Adriana Cole slid a folder across the table to him. "We need you to go first," she said. Marcus looked at the folder. Didn't open it. "Go first where?" "The Velhari have agreed to a preliminary communication exchange before they cross the boundary. Their choice, not ours, which is interesting because they've never done it before. In 9 dominions of expansion, they have never requested preliminary dialogue. They just move." She paused. "They're requesting it now."
Marcus thought about that.
"Because of the declaration." "Because of something in the declaration, yes. We don't know what." "The regards," Marcus said. Cole looked at him. "Possibly, yes." He finally opened the folder. It was thin 3 pages of briefing, a translation matrix, a psychological profile of Supreme Conductor Valeth compiled from 60 years of observation, and a single handwritten note at the back from someone in the Xenolinguistics department that read simply, "Be honest. They'll know if you're not. We don't know how, but they will." Marcus read the profile of Valeth twice. Then he looked up. "She's been reading the observer files," he said. "Presumably. So she knows we're unpredictable. By their models, yes." "Good," Marcus said, and Cole noticed, with some unease, that he sounded genuinely relieved by this. "That means she's already asking the right questions. We just have to give her answers she can dismiss." He closed the folder. "What's my timeline?" 46 hours until the boundary deadline." Marcus nodded slowly. Then, and Cole would think about this moment for years afterward, and would describe it in interviews as the thing that made her believe they might actually survive, he smiled. Not a brave smile. Not a performance. Something smaller and more honest than that. "Okay," he said. "Let's go talk to her." The transmission opened on a frequency the Velhari themselves had specified, and Marcus Webb appeared on the screen looking exactly like what he was, a tired man in a plain shirt, sitting at a metal table, with a cup of coffee going cold beside him. Valeth had been prepared for many things. She had not been prepared for the coffee.
It was such a small thing.
An organic liquid in a ceramic vessel, slightly steaming, clearly forgotten. It said, without saying anything, this person was doing something else before this call, and they stopped to take it and they didn't bother staging the environment. It said, "I am not performing for you." She found, to her deep confusion, that she trusted him slightly more because of the coffee. "Supreme Conductor Valeth," Marcus said. The pronunciation was careful and correct. He'd clearly practiced it, but not to the point of performance. "My name is Marcus Webb. I'm not a general or a head of state. I'm a person who talks to other people when things are about to go badly. My government asked me to talk to you first, and I said yes." He paused. "I want to be straightforward with you, if that's acceptable." Valeth's translator processed this. Then she responded through her own system, and the translation reached him as a sound like wind through a structured space, language that his brain processed as words, but that carried a texture of formality and age that no human language quite had. "Straightforward communication is acceptable," she said. "It is, in fact, the reason I requested this exchange." "Good." Marcus glanced down briefly. Not nervousness, Valeth noted. More like someone checking a mental list. "May I ask you something before we get to the official points?" "You may." "Did something in our declaration surprise you? Specifically, not strategically, I mean personally. Something that made you want to talk before acting?" The room behind Valeth, her advisors, her commanders, shifted. Dross's plating rattled, expressing a suppressed objection. This was not how preliminary dialogue was conducted. You did not ask the Supreme Conductor about her personal reactions. Valeth held up one elongated hand. She looked at Marcus Webb on the screen. And she said, "The word is regards." Marcus let out a slow breath. Something in his face softened. Not relief exactly. More like recognition. Like someone who'd been holding a question for a long time and finally heard it spoken aloud by someone else. "Yeah," he said. "That was deliberate." "Explain it." "It means, in that context, we see you as people. We're furious with you, we're terrified of you, and we're going to fight if we have to." But we still see you as people worth addressing formally. The anger and the respect aren't contradictions. They're both true at the same time. Valeth was very still. Your species does that often, she said carefully. Holds contradictions simultaneously. It's basically our whole thing, Marcus said. Then, quieter. Does that translate? The concept. A pause that lasted longer than translation required. No, Valeth said honestly. It does not. We have a word for holding two truths in sequence. We do not have a word for holding them at the same moment. She paused. It is one of the things in our observer reports that most consistently generated confusion. What did your observers think it was? A malfunction? Yes, initially. Marcus nodded slowly. It's not a malfunction. He stopped. Thought for a moment. It's how we survive things. If you can only feel one thing at a time, and it's terrible, you have nowhere to go. But if you can feel the terrible thing and also something else, even something small, even something ridiculous, you can keep moving. He picked up his coffee cup, realized it was cold, set it back down with a slightly rueful look. It's not that we don't feel the weight of things. It's that we've learned to carry weight and walk at the same time. Valeth's skin moved through 3 colors in 4 seconds, a speed her advisors had never seen. You are describing, she said slowly, a psychological architecture that we do not possess. I'm describing Tuesday, Marcus said simply. Valeth did something unprecedented in the Ninth Dominion. She extended the dialogue. Not by hours, by days. Dross argued against it, loudly, with his plating fully raised in a display of formal objection that would have shaken any other conductor. The boundary deadline came and went, and the fleet held position, and Marcus Webb kept showing up at his metal table with his cold coffee, and they kept talking. Not about terms. It is not about resources, autonomy, or the mechanics of surrender. About history. Walk me through it, Valeth said on the 3rd day. Your species' history of conflict. Not the official account, the texture of it. Marcus thought about those words for a long time. Do you want the honest version or the version we tell ourselves? The difference between them. The honest version, Marcus said, is that we've been at war with each other in some form for almost all of recorded history. Not because we're uniquely violent, I don't think we are, but because we're numerous, we're resource competitive, and we're deeply, sometimes catastrophically, tribal. We divide ourselves into groups and then treat the groups like they're the most important thing in the world, and then we hurt each other over the groups.
He paused.
The version we tell ourselves is that each war was the last one. Every single time. We always believe, afterward, that we have finally learned. But we continue. He was quiet a moment. And here's the part that I think your observers couldn't categorize. We know both things. We know the pattern. We can see it clearly in retrospect. We have historians and philosophers and ordinary people who can articulate exactly why we keep repeating it. The knowledge doesn't stop us. But it does something else. What does it do? It makes us grieve the repetition, Marcus said. We carry the weight of knowing we've failed before. And somehow that grief, that specific, recurring grief, is part of what builds the next attempt to do better. He looked directly at the screen. We don't improve because we've solved the problem. We improve in spite of failing to solve it, and because of failing to solve it at the same time. Valeth had stopped having her responses translated through formal channels. She was using the direct line now, just her voice and his, with the translation matrices running underneath. In the Velhari's documented history of expansion, she said, we have encountered 43 civilizations. 31 chose integration over conflict. Of the 12 who chose conflict, none survived past the first engagement. She paused. We did not grieve them. The statement landed in the space between them. I know, Marcus said quietly. What is the human response to that information? Marcus was quiet for what felt like a long time. Honestly, several things at once. He looked down at his hands.
Fear.
Anger. A kind of grief for people we never knew. And something underneath all of that, something that's harder to name, that's almost like...
He stopped.
Say it, Valeth said. Stubbornness, he said. A specific kind of stubbornness that kicks in when something is very terrible and you know it, where the badness of it doesn't make you give up. It makes you dig in. Not because you're sure you'll win, just because, he paused again. Because something in us doesn't know how to respond to this being hopeless except by continuing anyway. Another long silence. Then Valeth said something that her advisors would argue about for years afterward, debating whether it was tactical or genuine. I think, she said slowly, that this is the word we do not have. While Valeth talked, Dross did what military commanders do. He prepared. Not because he was insubordinate, he was many things but not that. He prepared because preparation was his function, and because something cold and practical in him recognized that dialogue, however unprecedented, was not a guarantee. The fleet held position at the boundary. The tactical assessments were updated daily. The integration protocols were reviewed. And Dross read the observer files. Not because Valeth had asked him to, because Maya's comment about wrong metrics had lodged in him like a stone in a joint, irritating, persistent, and impossible to ignore. He was a being who had spent 4 centuries being right about things. The idea that his models were not just incomplete but categorically wrong was not something he could process calmly.
So he read.
He started with the military assessments, which were what he expected, a species with significant creative capacity for weapons development, limited by their technological ceiling and outmatched by Velhari capabilities in every quantifiable dimension. Standard profile. Then he read Sevik's original reports. Then the next 40 years. Then Isla's final entries. He read for 11 hours without stopping, which was unusual for him. Velhari of his rank didn't consume information that way. They processed it through summaries, through hierarchy-filtered briefings, and through the elegant structures that kept a civilization of their complexity functioning. Raw data was for analysts. But he read raw. And somewhere around the 37th year of documentation, he stopped at a passage that Sevik had written almost as a footnote, an observation so outside his analytical framework that he'd clearly recorded it without knowing what to do with it. Observe today. A human who had lost a family member in a conflict that humans themselves had caused, through a political failure that could have been prevented, sitting in a public space, helping a stranger who was also grieving an unrelated loss. Not because the stranger asked. I could not identify any social obligation. Apparently, because the presence of grief in another triggered a compulsion to respond to it, regardless of origin or connection. I do not know what to call this. It is not strategic. It is not transactional. It appears to be simply something they do. Dross read this 3 times. Then he went back to the military assessments. He read them differently now. Not as data points in a predictive model, but as descriptions of a species as seen through frameworks that had been built without accounting for what Sevik had described. The assessments indicated limited technology, one inhabited world, and no fold travel. What they didn't say, what no framework Dross had ever used would know to measure, was a species that responds to grief with connection. That carries the weight of its failures as a generative force rather than a terminal one. That holds contradictions simultaneously and uses the tension between them as fuel. He filed no formal report, but that evening, he went to Valeth's private chamber and stood in the doorway for a long moment before speaking. I want to show you something in the projections, he said. She looked up from her light surface. The standard ones?
No, he said.
The ones I've been running privately. I've been running them privately for the last 6 hours. His plating was still. Not raised in objection. Not signaling anything definable. I think our probability models are based on a fundamental misread of what the species does under terminal pressure. Valeth waited. Every species we've encountered, Dross said slowly, when facing a sufficiently overwhelming threat, reaches a point of behavioral coherence. Fear unifies them around self-preservation. It's predictable. It's measurable. It's how our models work. He paused. Humanity, under terminal pressure, does not unify around self-preservation. What do they unify around? The silence before his answer was the longest she had heard from him in 4 centuries of service. Each other, he said. They unify around each other, not the concept of survival but the specific, individual people next to them. The scale of the threat doesn't change it. If anything, the scale increases it. He looked directly at her. I don't know how to model that. I've been trying for 6 hours, and I cannot make it fit. Valeth's skin went white again. Sit down, she said quietly, and tell me everything. Marcus had been in the bunker for 9 days when Dr. Sarah Chin knocked on the door of his small assigned room and sat down across from him without asking. Sarah was the xenopsychologist attached to the negotiation team, technically his superior in the hierarchy of the operation, practically more of a parallel presence. She'd been watching the transmissions. All of them. How are you doing? She asked. Honestly, always.
Marcus thought about it.
I feel like I'm trying to explain color to someone who has only ever seen in grayscale, he said. Not because she's limited. Because the concept genuinely doesn't exist in her perceptual framework. He rubbed his face. She's brilliant. She's been asking the right questions.
She wants to understand.
But there are things I'm saying that I can see not landing, not because of translation problems, but because the receiving structure for them isn't there. What things? The simultaneity stuff. Holding contradictions. He looked at his hands. I explained grief as fuel yesterday, and she went quiet for about 4 minutes, which I'm told is very unusual for her. But I don't know if she understood it or just cataloged it as information. Sarah nodded. What do you think is actually happening on their side? I think, Marcus said carefully, that she came into this universe expecting to find a species that was strategically interesting, a tactical anomaly. And instead she's finding something that's making her question frameworks she's used for 400 years.
He paused.
Which is, that's a terrifying thing to have happen to you, even if you're not human. This is especially true if you are not human and have built an entire civilization based on the precision of your frameworks. Do you feel sorry for her? Marcus looked up. Yes, he said, simply and without apology. I do.
Genuinely.
She's not a villain. She's a person, or the nearest thing to it, who's spent her whole life being right about things, and she's sitting across from a species that her tools can't read, and the closer she looks, the less she understands, and he stopped. That's lonely. Sarah looked at him for a moment. You know that the people 2 floors up are currently drafting contingency military responses. I know. You understand that a failure in this dialogue or a misinterpretation of our words could potentially lead to the worst possible outcome. I know that too. And you're sitting here feeling sorry for the person across the table. Yeah, Marcus said. Several things at once. That's the job. Sarah was quiet for a moment. Then, she asked for you specifically. They sent a message an hour ago. She wants to continue the dialogue, but she wants to shift the topic. To what? Sarah handed him a translation sheet. He read it. The Velhari phrase in the original was complex, 14 syllables that the translation matrix had rendered as a question, but that the xenolinguistics team had flagged as something more than a question. More like a confession wrapped in inquiry. What do you do with the knowledge that you might be wrong about everything? Marcus sat with that for a long time. Then he stood up, picked up his cold coffee, and walked back toward the transmission room. Tell her I'm on my way, he said. He set the coffee down. Saturday. Looked at the screen. Valeth was there, as she always was, but something was different in the quality of her stillness today. Her skin was a color Marcus had started privately calling thinking blue, a deep, even shade that appeared when she was processing something that didn't have a ready category. You sent me a question, he said. I did. I want to answer it honestly. I know you do, she said. That is why I sent it to you, and not to your generals. Marcus breathed. What do we do with the knowledge that we might be wrong about everything? He turned the question over. The honest answer is, we sit with it. Usually very badly. We don't have a graceful relationship with uncertainty. It frightens us. We build systems and structures and belief frameworks specifically to avoid having to feel it directly. He paused. But underneath that, under all the systems, there's something we do that I think might be specific to us. When we're confronted with being fundamentally, structurally wrong about something important, we...
He stopped.
Say it, Valeth said, almost exactly the way he had said it to her 3 days ago. We get curious, he said. Not all of us, not all the time, and God knows not gracefully. But there's a reflex, a deep one, toward what is it actually then if not what I thought? We can't help it. Even when it's terrifying. Even when being wrong means everything has to be rebuilt from scratch. He looked at her directly. Is that not how it works for your people? No, Valeth said. What happens for you? A long pause. When a Velhari framework fails, she said carefully, the correct response is to identify the anomalous variable and correct it. The framework itself is not questioned. The framework is the product of 9 dominions of verification. A single anomaly does not invalidate a framework. It means the anomaly was incorrectly classified. And if the anomaly keeps being anomalous, then the classification is refined until it fits. Marcus nodded slowly. So, your approach to being wrong is to find a way to be right that incorporates the wrong thing. Yes. And the framework never gets questioned. The framework, Valeth said, and something shifted in her voice, something textural that his translation matrix struggled with, and that the xenolinguistics team would spend weeks analyzing, is what we are. The silence that followed was different from all the previous silences. Valeth, Marcus said. First time he'd used just her name, without the title, and he'd done it without planning to. May I ask you something outside the official dialogue? Yes. What does it feel like right now? Not strategically. Not analytically. What does it feel like to be talking to us? The walls of her chamber, visible in the background of her transmission feed, had gone a shade darker. Like standing at the edge of something with no measurement, she said quietly. And I do not know if the correct response is to step back or to look down. Marcus looked at her for a long moment. That's how we feel all the time, he said gently. Your entire civilization feels like what Tuesday feels like to us. Something moved across Valeth's face that her advisors had never seen and didn't have a name for. It would take them years to categorize it. They eventually settled on the closest Velhari equivalent, a word that meant, roughly, the vertigo of a framework meeting its edge. Humans, if they had been present, would have recognized it immediately. They would have called it awe. The War Council met, without Valeth. This was not the first time. There were logistical sessions she delegated, but the reason for her absence was unprecedented. She was still in dialogue. Hour 14 of what was supposed to be a preliminary exchange. Dross stood at the center of the room and looked at the 12 high conductors, who, collectively, held 4,000 years of institutional knowledge between them. I want to formally register a concern, he said. Several sensory stalks turned toward him. Our readiness posture, Dross said, is built on a probability model that assumes human behavior under maximum pressure follows a degradation curve. Fear, then fragmentation, then collapse. This model has predicted outcomes correctly in 216 prior conflicts. Then the concern is, one of the older conductors was prompt. The model does not account for what their behavior actually is under maximum pressure, Dross said. We have 60 years of observer documentation that describes a different curve entirely. Not degradation. Something more like, he paused, searching for language that didn't exist in the Velhari vocabulary. Condensation. Under pressure, they become more themselves. More unified. More creative. More, another pause. More. More is not a tactical variable, said the conductor of military logistics. No, Dross agreed. It's not. That's the problem. He pulled up his private projections, the ones he'd run over 6 hours, the ones that had sent him to Valeth's door. The room looked at them in silence. These are scenarios, he said. Not our standard models. New ones are built on observer data rather than on cross-species military history. He paused. In every scenario where we proceed with conventional integration protocols, the conflict extends significantly beyond our projected timeline. Not because their technology surprises us, because their behavior does. They adapt faster than our models account for. They share information across social groups in ways that compress their technological development cycle. And they...
He stopped.
Say it, said Maya, from her seat near the door. She'd been quiet all meeting, young and quiet and watching. They treat losses as information, Dross said flatly. Every engagement loss, rather than causing behavioral degradation, causes rapid strategy revision. Our advantage in technology diminishes faster than it should because every time they fail, they figure out why, and they correct for it, and they come back. He looked around the room. We are not fighting a species that will break. We are fighting a species that has, by their own historical documentation, never learned how to stay broken. The room was quiet. How long? The military logistics conductor finally asked. To full resolution of conflict?
Dross paused.
My best model indicates 4 Dominion years. Other models say longer. He let that land. For a species we classified as 200 years behind us technologically.
4 Dominion years, minimum.
More likely longer. Possibly. He stopped himself. Say the rest, Maya said. Possibly open-ended, Dross said quietly. This may be a conflict that does not end within our modeling capacity. Our modeling capacity assumes eventual resolution, but I cannot find a point in their historical or behavioral data where they reach that level, where they stop, where the weight becomes too heavy. He looked at the walls, darkening now, truly darkening. In 43 prior civilizations that point existed. It was different for each species, but it existed. For this one, he shook his head. I cannot find it. There was a room in the bunker that Marcus didn't have access to. Not because anyone was hiding something dramatic. Information compartmentalization was standard procedure because the dialogue team didn't need the components of the full picture of a planetary defense situation, and the people in that room were doing their jobs. General Cole was in that room. She was looking at a display that showed the Velhari fleet, 1,200 ships, positioned in a formation that their military analysts called the breath before the word. Ready. Patient. Not moving. Her people were doing what humans do, working, arguing, solving problems that didn't have solutions, and finding partial solutions anyway. There were 17 independent teams across the globe running parallel research tracks on everything from atmospheric defense to full drive replication. Most of them were probably going to fail. Several would produce partial results that could be applied to adjacent problems. One, statistically, historically, based on how humans work under impossible pressure, would probably produce something no one had predicted. They didn't know which one. That was the inherent aspect of humans that could not be encapsulated within a model. They were equally unaware. They weren't working toward a specific solution. They were working because it was what you did, and because somewhere in the gap between now and disaster, something might emerge. It had before. Not always. Not reliably. Not with any guarantees. But before. Cole looked at the fleet and thought about Marcus, 2 floors down, talking. She thought about what he'd said when she'd briefed him. Let me give her something real. Not strategy. Something true. She'd let him do it because she'd seen him work before, and because they were out of better options, and because if she was being honest, which she tried to be at least in the hours between midnight and 4 a.m. when the performance of confidence wasn't required, because something in his approach felt more aligned with who they actually were than anything else she had. Humans didn't win by being the strongest. They didn't even win by being the smartest. They won when they won by being relentless in a way that wasn't aggression. By continuing past the point where continuation made logical sense. By turning limitation into a kind of terrible, exhausting, unkillable resource. She looked at the fleet. She thought, we have been declared war upon by 9 dominions of unchallenged galactic power. She thought, and somehow that mostly just makes us more ourselves. She almost laughed. Didn't quite. Picked up her cold coffee. Drank it anyway. On the 12th day, Valeth called a formal session. Not dialogue. It was not the private 2-person exchange that she and Marcus had been conducting. A formal, recorded, full council session with both sides present, Velhari High Conductors and Earth Council representatives, transmission open, translators running, and the whole architecture of official communication deployed. Marcus sat at his table. Next to him, for the first time, was General Cole. On his other side, Dr. Sarah Chen. Behind them, 3 council representatives he'd barely spoken to. Across the transmission, Valeth. And behind her, visible for the first time, her full council, 12 high conductors, plus Dross, plus Maya. Valeth spoke first. I will make a statement, she said, and then I will ask a question. The statement is not strategic. It is honest, And I am making it because 12 days of dialogue have led me to believe that honesty is the only register in which meaningful communication between our species is possible. Marcus felt Cole go very still beside him. In 9 dominions, Valeth said, we have encountered 43 civilizations and integrated 42 of them. We did not ask what they were before integrating them. We assessed, we classified, and we proceeded. This decision was correct by every standard we possessed, and it produced the 9th dominion, which is by every measure a successful civilization.
She paused.
You are the first species we have encountered for whom our standards are insufficient. Not inadequate. Insufficient. They cannot reach you. The tools by which we have understood 42 worlds do not have the resolution to describe what you are. The formal session had a protocol.
No one was supposed to speak out of turn.
Marcus spoke out of turn. We don't fully understand it ourselves, he said. Just so you know, we're not holding out on you. We've been trying to figure out what we are for as long as we've been around.
A beat.
Then Valeth and the high conductors behind her, and Dross with his still plating, and young Maya, did something the translation matrix captured as a sound, but that the Xenolinguistics team would later describe as the Velhari equivalent of a short, startled laugh. The first one in the history of formal Velhari-human interaction. I know, Valeth said. That is in the observer files, too. A pause that felt, for the first time, like shared breath rather than calculation. My question is this. You declared war on us. Formally, politely, with regards. You knew our history. You knew our capabilities. You knew the outcome of every prior conflict. She looked directly at the transmission lens. Why? The council representatives behind Marcus shifted.
Cole started to speak.
Marcus put his hand up. Everyone let him. Because, he said, the alternative was to decide in advance that we had already lost. And we can't do that. Not because we're arrogant. Not because we think we can beat you. He paused. Because there's something in us that treats giving up before it's over as a kind of death. Not physical death. Something harder to define. The death of the thing that makes us what we are. He looked at her. We declared war because we're still here. That's what the declaration meant. Not that we think we can win. Just, we're still here. Come and see who you're dealing with. The walls of Valeth's chamber, visible in the background of the transmission, were no longer dark. They were a color none of her advisors had a reference for. Not Dominion blue. Not conflict red. Something new. Something the mineral walls had generated in response to an emotional resonance they had never been asked to represent before. Ob SYMJHY, Valeth said, and the phrase was in her own language, unprocessed, untranslated, and spoken directly. The translation matrix rendered it, haltingly, as from this moment on, I understand differently. Marcus looked at her for a long moment. Caro, he said, and it was the first human word he'd spoken in the Velhari register, coached by the Xenolinguistics team for exactly this moment, a word they'd identified as the closest available bridge between the two languages' concepts of threshold and beginning. Then let's start. The Velhari fleet did not cross the boundary. This is the part that history books, both human ones and the crystalline Velhari dataforms that serve the same function, would spend considerable time on because it was unprecedented, and unprecedented things demand extensive documentation. What actually happened was less dramatic and more human than any of the official accounts suggested. Valeth and Marcus talked for 11 more days. Then formal working groups. Then, a thing that had no Velhari precedent and only scattered human ones, a joint commission tasked not with terms of integration or surrender, but with the genuinely open-ended project of understanding each other well enough to decide together what came next. It was slow. It was frequently frustrating. There were 3 near collapses in the process, each caused by a different kind of framework failure and resolved in a way that the prior failure had made possible. Dross, who had spent 4 centuries being right about things, became the Velhari's most vocal advocate for the commission. He would later write, in a private document that was not intended for broad circulation and was therefore read by almost everyone, that the moment he understood humanity was not the grand transmission exchange, but the observer file entry about Sevik watching a grieving human help a grieving stranger for no articulable reason. That was the moment I realized we had been trying to measure the ocean with a ruler, he wrote. The ruler is not wrong. The ocean is simply not a thing rulers are for. Marcus went home to an apartment he'd barely seen in a year. He made fresh coffee. He stood in his kitchen drinking it while it was still hot, which felt like a small, extraordinary luxury. Sarachan called him on a Tuesday. Valeth sent a transmission, she said. Personal. For you. What does it say? It says, Sarah paused. He could hear her smiling. It says, I've been trying to understand Tuesday. I believe I am beginning to. Regards, Valeth. Marcus stood in his kitchen for a long time after hanging up. He was thinking about 43 civilizations. 31 had chosen integration, while 12 had chosen to fight and lost. He was thinking about what it cost to be the species that broke frameworks just by existing. He was thinking about grief and stubbornness and the particular unkillable quality of continuing past the point where it made sense. He was thinking about a being 400 years old who had spent 9 dominions being certain, sitting across a transmission link watching her certainty become something new and calling it by its right name. He thought, we almost didn't make it. We almost didn't get to find out. He thought, but Tuesday came anyway. He finished his coffee. He started the next thing. That is, after all, what humans do.
The end.